When a school custodian sees a young girl stumble from the bathroom, her eyes swollen with tears and her voice quivering as she whispers three chilling words, he knows this is no ordinary school event. His heart drops, and he realizes he's about to uncover a truth that could destroy the school's flawless reputation. This is a tale of bravery, resolve, and the unyielding quest for justice amidst overwhelming challenges. Before delving into this narrative, let us know where you're joining us from and if you stand for what's right. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. The fluorescent lights hummed quietly in the otherwise silent corridor of Riverbend Academy. Harold Bennett, a 52-year-old custodian, methodically moved his mop across the gleaming floor. The faint scent of disinfectant mingled with the distant laughter of children playing outside. It was a routine Harold had grown to cherish, a rhythm that kept his thoughts engaged and his heart at ease. But today was different. A sharp sound shattered the silence, a door slamming open, followed by hurried steps. Harold looked up just in time to see Lily Warren, a third grader with strawberry blonde hair, stumbling from the girls' restroom. Her face was ashen, her eyes wide with fear, her small frame almost collapsing under an unseen burden. "Lily," Harold called, concern threading through his voice as he left his mop behind and hurried to her. The girl's gaze flitted around the empty corridor before settling on Harold. Tears flowed down her cheeks as she staggered closer, her lips forming words he couldn't quite catch at first. "Mr. Bennett," she gasped, clutching his arm as if he were her lifeline. "He touched me." The words struck Harold like a physical blow, his heart stopping briefly, his breath catching. He crouched to her level, his hands gently resting on her shoulders. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice low but urgent. Lily didn't respond. Her legs gave way, and she collapsed into his arms, sobbing uncontrollably. Harold's mind raced as he held her, his protective instincts kicking in. Whatever had happened, he knew he had to act swiftly. "Lily, it's okay. You're safe now," he murmured, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "Let's get you to the nurse." He gently lifted her into his arms, carrying her down the hallway with quick but measured steps. He opened the door to the nurse's office where Karen Murdoch, the school nurse, was sorting supplies. She looked up, her brow furrowing at the sight. "Karen, I need your help," Harold said, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "Something's happened." Karen rushed forward, her face a mix of concern and professionalism. Together, they helped Lily onto a small bed in the corner. Karen knelt by the girl, her voice soothing as she asked, "Lily, can you tell me what happened?" But Lily only shook her head, gripping Harold's hand tightly as if he were her anchor. Harold squeezed her hand, his mind replaying her words over and over. "He touched me." As Karen tried to coax more information from Lily, Harold stepped back, his chest tightening. Memories of his daughter Emily flashed through his mind. Her laughter, her bright eyes, the day she was taken from him in a tragic accident. The pain was still fresh, even after all these years. He had failed to protect Emily, but he would not fail Lily. Karen's voice broke through his thoughts. "Harold, we need to report this," she said firmly. "I know," he replied, his jaw clenching. "I'll speak to the principal right now." Leaving Karen with Lily, Harold walked to Principal Greg Timmons' office, the short journey feeling like an eternity, his mind swirling with questions. Who was he? What had happened in that bathroom? And most importantly, how could he ensure Lily's safety? Reaching the office, Harold knocked sharply before entering. Principal Timmons sat behind a large oak desk, his suit impeccably tailored, his demeanor as collected as ever. He looked up from his papers, raising an eyebrow. "Mr. Bennett," Timmons said, his tone clipped. "What can I do for you?" Harold didn't waste time. "We have a problem," he said, his voice firm. "Lily Warren just came out of the girls' bathroom in tears." She said. He paused, the weight of the words making them hard to voice. She said someone touched her. For a moment, Timmons' expression was neutral. Then he leaned back, his eyes narrowing. "Touched her? Are you sure that's what she said?" "I'm sure," Harold replied, his voice steady. "We need to investigate this immediately. Whoever did this." "Let's not jump to conclusions," Timmons interrupted, his tone dismissive. "Children can be imaginative. There's probably nothing." Harold felt a surge of frustration. "This isn't nothing," he said, his voice rising slightly. "She's terrified, Greg. We can't just ignore this." Timmons sighed, leaning forward and folding his hands on the desk. "Mr. Bennett, I understand your concern, but you're a custodian, not an investigator. Leave this to the professionals." The condescension in Timmons' voice was like a slap, but Harold refused to back down. "I'm not asking for much," he said, his tone firm. "Just talk to Lily, find out what happened." Timmons shook his head, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. "I'll handle it, Mr. Bennett. You can return to your duties." Harold clenched his fists, anger simmering beneath the surface. "If you don't take this seriously, I will," he said, his voice low but resolute. Timmons' smile faded, replaced by a cold, hard glare. "Careful, Mr. Bennett," he warned. "You're on thin ice as it is. Don't make this into something it isn't." Harold stared at him for a moment, his jaw tight. Without another word, he turned and left the office, his mind made up. If the administration wouldn't act, he would. As he walked back to the nurse's office, his thoughts turned to Lily, the fear in her eyes, the trembling in her voice. It all pointed to something far more serious than Timmons was willing to admit. Harold didn't know how he would do it, but he was determined to uncover the truth and protect Lily at all costs. The hallways of Riverbend Academy felt unusually quiet as Harold made his way back. The muted thud of his boots against the polished floor seemed almost deafening in the silence, his mind swirling with a mix of anger and determination. His earlier conversation with Greg Timmons had been far from satisfactory, but Harold was not the type to retreat, especially when a child's safety was at stake. The principal's office was located at the far end of the administrative wing, behind an imposing oak door adorned with a polished brass nameplate reading, "Principal Gregory Timmons." Harold hesitated briefly before knocking firmly. "Come in," Timmons' voice called, crisp and authoritative. Harold pushed the door open to find Timmons seated behind his expansive desk, papers neatly organized in front of him. He was impeccably dressed as always, in a tailored navy suit and a perfectly knotted tie. His salt and pepper hair was combed neatly, and his piercing blue eyes regarded Harold with a mix of curiosity and mild irritation. "Mr. Bennett," Timmons said, gesturing for Harold to enter. "What brings you back so soon? I assume this is about Lily Warren." Harold's jaw tightened. He had barely stepped inside, and already he sensed the subtle condescension in Timmons' tone. He stepped forward, his shoulders squared, fixing Timmons with a determined stare. "Yes, sir," Harold began, his voice steady. "I've been thinking about what Lily said. This isn't something we can ignore. That little girl was scared out of her mind, and I think we need to get to the bottom of it." Timmons leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers as a faint smile played at the corners of his lips. "Mr. Bennett," he said slowly, "I admire your concern, but as I mentioned earlier, children can be imaginative. It's possible she misunderstood something or exaggerated." "Exaggerated," Harold repeated, his voice rising slightly. "You didn't see her face. She was terrified, Greg. That's not imagination." Timmons' smile faded, replaced by a cold, calculating look. "Harold," he said, his tone sharpening, You're a custodian, not an investigator. I appreciate your enthusiasm, but this is a matter for school administration, not the custodial staff. Harold felt a flash of anger but maintained his composure. I may be a custodian, but I know when something's not right, he said firmly. We owe it to Lily to take this seriously. At the very least, she needs to be interviewed by someone trained to handle these situations. Timon's expression darkened, and he leaned forward, placing his hands flat on the desk. And I'm telling you, Mr. Bennett, that we have protocols in place. There's no need for you to involve yourself further. Harold clenched his fists at his sides, his frustration boiling over. What protocols? He demanded. Because all I've seen is a little girl in distress, and a principal who seems more interested in sweeping this under the rug than finding out the truth. Timon's voice took on a sneer. Careful, Mr. Bennett, he said, his tone low and threatening. You're walking a very fine line. If you continue to disrupt the school environment with baseless accusations, I won't hesitate to reconsider your position here. Harold stared at him, his chest tight with suppressed rage. He wanted to shout, to demand answers, but he knew that losing his temper would only play into Timon's hands. Instead, he took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. Is that a threat? Harold asked, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. Timmons leaned back in his chair, his smirk returning. It's a reminder, Mr. Bennett, of where you stand in this institution. Now, if there's nothing else, I suggest you return to your duties. For a moment, Harold didn't move, the weight of Timmons' words hanging heavy in the air. But so too did the memory of Lily's tear-streaked face. Finally, Harold turned on his heel and walked out of the office, his steps measured but purposeful as he made his way back down the hallway. Harold's thoughts churned. Timmons might have dismissed him, but Harold wasn't about to let the matter drop. He couldn't, not when every instinct told him that Lily was in danger. That evening, in his modest kitchen, Harold sat nursing a cup of black coffee, staring at an old photograph on the table. A picture of his late wife, Laura, and their daughter, Emily. Emily had been around Lily's age when she passed. A bright, spirited girl with a smile that could light up a room. Losing her had been the hardest thing Harold had ever endured, and not a day went by without him thinking of her. He ran a hand through his graying hair, the weight of those memories pressing down on him. It was that weight, he realized, that made him so determined to protect Lily. He couldn't save Emily, but maybe, just maybe, he could save another little girl from her nightmare. Later that day, Harold found himself in the school's small, cluttered nurse's office. Karen Murdoch, the school nurse, was leaning against the edge of her desk, her arms crossed as she regarded Harold with a mix of curiosity and concern. You're not usually one to linger, Harold, Karen said, her tone light but probing. What's on your mind? Harold hesitated, glancing at the closed door before speaking. It's about Lily Warren, he said. You've seen her in here a lot, haven't you? Karen nodded slowly. She's been coming in pretty frequently. She admitted headaches, stomach aches, vague complaints. Nothing I could ever really pin down. Harold frowned. Do you think it's just nerves? Or could it be something else? Karen sighed, her expression troubled. I've wondered the same thing, she admitted. But without any concrete evidence, there's not much I can do. Kids have bad days. Sometimes it's hard to tell when it's something more. Harold leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. What about other students? Have you noticed anything similar with them? Karen hesitated, her eyes narrowing as she studied Harold's face. Why are you asking me this? She said cautiously. Because I think something's going on, Harold replied. I don't have proof yet, but I've seen enough to make me worry. Lily's not the only one who's scared. I've seen it in other kids too. Karen's lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment, she didn't respond. Then she let out a heavy sigh and nodded. There have been others, she admitted. Not many, but enough to make me wonder. A few years ago, a boy came in with bruises on his arms. He said he'd fallen on the playground, but it didn't add up, and there was a girl who suddenly refused to come to school. Her parents pulled her out a month later. No explanation. Harold felt a surge of anger and determination. Why didn't anyone do anything? He asked. Karen shook her head. What could we do without evidence? It's just speculation and Timmons. He's not exactly the type to welcome questions. Harold nodded grimly. I'm not letting this slide, Karen. Not this time. Lily needs us, and so do the other kids. Karen studied him for a long moment before nodding. All right, she said. I'll help you, but we have to be careful. If Timmons gets wind of this... I know, Harold said. We'll keep it quiet. In the weeks that followed, Harold became a quiet but vigilant presence in the school. He carried a small notebook in his pocket, jotting down anything that seemed suspicious. A hurried conversation between Timmons and a teacher, a student leaving the principal's office with tear-streaked cheeks, a subtle look of fear in a child's eyes. At the same time, he and Karen began sharing their observations in secret, piecing together a troubling pattern of behavior. Timmons' disciplinary measures often seemed to target the most vulnerable students, those who were new, shy, or otherwise unlikely to speak up. And while there was no concrete evidence of wrongdoing, the sheer number of red flags was impossible to ignore. But Harold wasn't the only one watching. He soon realized that Timmons had begun to take an unusual interest in him. The principal's gaze seemed to linger on Harold longer than necessary during staff meetings, and Harold often caught him glancing his way in the hallways. One afternoon, as Harold was mopping the cafeteria floor, Timmons appeared in the doorway. Mr. Bennett, Timmons said, his tone cordial but laced with an edge of suspicion. How's everything going? Harold straightened, keeping his expression neutral. Just fine, sir, he replied. Timmons nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing. Good. I like to think we run a tight ship here at Riverbend. No room for distractions or unnecessary concerns. Harold met Timmons' gaze, refusing to look away. Of course, he said evenly. Timmons smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Glad to hear it. Keep up the good work. As Timmons turned and walked away, Harold's grip tightened on the mop handle. He didn't need to hear the words to understand the message. Timmons knew Harold was watching, and he didn't like it. But Harold didn't care. If anything, the principal's thinly veiled warning only strengthened his resolve. Whatever secrets Timmons was hiding, Harold was determined to bring them to light, even if it meant putting himself in danger. The school had long emptied for the day, and the silence of Riverbend Academy was almost eerie. Harold Bennett sat on a wooden bench outside the nurse's office, his hands clasped tightly together. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the corridor, but Harold barely noticed. His mind was fixated on what he needed to do next. Karen had assured him she would watch for any further signs of distress among the students, but Harold knew the time for quiet observation was over. He needed answers, and he needed them now. A soft shuffle of footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. Looking up, Harold saw Lily Warren standing hesitantly at the end of the hallway. Her small figure seemed even smaller in the dim light, her backpack hanging limply from one shoulder. She caught sight of Harold and paused, her expression uncertain. Lily, Harold called gently, his voice warm and inviting. Come here for a moment, sweetheart. I just want to talk. Lily hesitated, glancing around the empty corridor before slowly making her way toward him. Her steps were cautious, as if she was afraid of being seen. Harold motioned for her to sit beside him. It's all right, he said softly. You're not in trouble. I just want to make sure you're okay. Lily sat down, her small hands clutching the straps of her backpack. She didn't meet Harold's gaze, her eyes fixed on the floor. Lily, Harold began, choosing his words carefully. I know something's been bothering you. I've seen it in the way you carry yourself, the way you avoid looking at people, and I think it has something to do with Principal Timmons. At the mention of Timmons' name, Lily flinched, her grip on her backpack tightening. Harold's heart ached at the sight. You can trust me, Lily, Harold said gently. Whatever's going on, you don't have to face it alone. For a moment, there was only silence. Then Lily whispered so softly Harold had to lean in to hear her. He calls me to his office a lot, says it's for counseling. Harold's chest tightened, but he kept his voice steady. What happens in these counseling sessions? Lily hesitated, her eyes darting around the hallway as if checking for eavesdroppers. He says I have to be a good student, she muttered, but he stands too close sometimes. He touches my shoulder or my hair. It makes me feel weird. Harold swallowed hard, his hands clenching into fists. Does he ever hurt you? Lily shook her head quickly. No, but I don't like it. I told him once and he got really mad. Said I was being ungrateful. The weight of Lily's words settled heavily on Harold's shoulders. She was too young to fully understand the implications of what she was saying, but Harold understood all too well. Lily, he said firmly but kindly, you did nothing wrong. You hear me? Nothing. What he's doing is not okay, and I'm going to make sure it stops. Lily looked up at him then, her wide eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. Promise? She whispered. I promise, Harold said without hesitation. That evening, Harold stood outside the modest suburban home of Margaret and Andrew Warren. He had debated all afternoon whether to approach them, knowing the conversation would be difficult. But Lily's trembling voice replayed in his mind, and he knew he had no choice. Taking a deep breath, Harold knocked on the door. It opened a moment later to reveal Margaret Warren, a petite woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. Mr. Bennet, she said, clearly surprised to see him. Is everything all right? Did something happen with Lily? Mrs. Warren, Harold began, his voice steady but serious. I need to speak with you and your husband. It's about Lily. May I come in? Margaret hesitated, her brow furrowing. Andrew, she called over her shoulder, come here for a moment. A tall, broad-shouldered man appeared behind her, his expression wary. What's this about? He asked, his voice deep and measured. It's about your daughter, Harold said. I believe there's something happening at the school that you need to know about. Margaret and Andrew exchanged a glance before stepping aside to let Harold in. They led him to the living room where Harold sat on the edge of the couch, his hands resting on his knees. Margaret and Andrew sat across from him, their expressions a mix of concern and impatience. Lily has been coming to the nurse's office frequently, Harold began. She's been avoiding her classmates and seems troubled. Today, I spoke with her, and she told me that Principal Timmons has been calling her to his office for counseling sessions. Margaret frowned. Counseling? What kind of counseling? That's the problem, Harold said. She says he makes her uncomfortable, that he stands too close, touches her hair or shoulders. She's scared of him. Andrew's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists. Are you saying Timmons is inappropriate with our daughter? I don't have concrete proof, Harold admitted, but based on what Lily told me and what I've observed, I believe there's cause for concern. I wanted to bring this to your attention because I know how hard it is for children to speak up. Margaret shook her head, her face pale. I can't believe this. Lily never said anything to us. She might not have known how, Harold said gently. Children often don't have the words to explain what they're feeling. That's why it's so important to listen to the signs. Andrew leaned forward, his eyes locked on Harold's. "Why are you so invested in this, Mr. Bennett? You're just the janitor. Why go out on a limb for our daughter?" Harold hesitated, the weight of his own past pressing heavily on him. "Because I lost my daughter," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "She was only 8. I wasn't there when she needed me, and I've had to live with that every day since. I couldn't save her, but maybe I can help Lily." The room fell silent, Harold's words hanging heavily in the air. Finally, Margaret reached out and placed a hand on his arm. "Thank you," she said softly. "Thank you for caring about our daughter. We'll talk to her tonight and figure out what to do next." Harold nodded, a small sense of relief washing over him. "Please," he said, "be patient with her. She's been through a lot, even if she doesn't fully understand it." As Harold left the Warrens' home that evening, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight was far from over, but for the first time he wasn't fighting it alone. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of Riverbend Academy as Harold Bennett began his shift. The rhythmic swish of his mop against the tiled floor was a constant hum beneath his thoughts, but his mind wasn't on the task at hand. Every interaction, every hallway glance, every shadowed corner was now tinged with suspicion. Harold's focus had shifted. He wasn't just the janitor anymore. He was a man on a mission, driven by Lily Warren's trembling words and the grim truths they hinted at. Karen Murdoch, the school nurse, had proven to be an invaluable ally. That morning, she met Harold in the supply closet, where she pretended to be checking the inventory. Her face was pale, her voice hushed. "I've been going through the school's medical records," Karen began, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "Lily isn't the only one. There are other girls who have come to me with vague complaints, headaches, stomach aches, things that don't add up. And they all share one thing in common: frequent visits to Timmons' office before they show up in mine." Harold frowned, his grip tightening on the mop handle. "How many?" "4," Karen whispered, "but it's all circumstantial. I don't have concrete proof, just patterns." "That's enough to keep digging," Harold said firmly. "Timmons is careful, but people like him always make mistakes. We just have to catch him in one." Karen nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I'll keep looking, but I need to be discreet. If he finds out—" Harold raised a hand to stop her. "I know the risks. I'll handle the rest." Over the next several days, Harold became a quiet, watchful presence in the school. He positioned himself in strategic spots, always within earshot of Timmons when possible. He took mental notes of every interaction, every too long pause, every closed-door meeting. His efforts didn't go unnoticed. One afternoon, as Harold wiped down the trophy case near the principal's office, Timmons emerged, his sharp gaze landing squarely on Harold. "Bennett," Timmons called, his voice dripping with condescension. "The science lab floors need scrubbing. Make sure you get every inch this time. I noticed some grime near the sinks yesterday. Sloppy work, even for a janitor." Harold straightened, forcing his expression to remain neutral. "Yes, sir. I'll take care of it." Timmons smirked, his eyes narrowing. "Good. And while you're at it, the cafeteria trash bins are overflowing. Don't let that happen again." The exchange drew the attention of passing students, some of whom snickered at Timmons' tone. Harold met their glances with quiet resolve. He wouldn't let the principal's attempts to undermine him deter his mission. Late one evening, long after the school had emptied, Harold found himself outside Timmons' office. The hallway was eerily silent, the fluorescent lights casting a cold glow over the linoleum floor. Harold's pulse quickened as he examined the door. He knew breaking in would be reckless and could cost him his job or worse, but something about the locked office nagged at him. His gaze landed on the principal's desk, visible through the narrow window. Papers were neatly stacked, but something caught his eye. A small brass key sitting atop a folder. Harold's breath hitched. He didn't know what the key opened, but its presence alone felt significant. Before he could think twice, Harold slipped a piece of gum from his pocket, unwrapped it, and carefully pressed the wrapper against the glass, obscuring the view of his actions from anyone who might pass by. Then, using the mop handle, he gently slid the folder closer to the edge of the desk until the key tumbled to the floor. Heart-pounding, Harold crouched and picked up the key. It was small, unmarked, and unassuming, yet its weight in his hand felt heavy with implication. He didn't have time to linger. Harold pocketed the key and straightened, his mind already racing with possibilities. He couldn't risk searching the office now, not with security cameras in the hallway, but he had a strong suspicion that whatever this key unlocked would be the next step in uncovering the truth. The next morning, Harold approached Karen in the nurse's office, his tone low and urgent. "I found something," he said, pulling the key from his pocket and holding it out to her. Karen's eyes widened. "What is it for?" "I don't know yet," Harold admitted, "but it's from Timmons' office. I'm betting it opens something he doesn't want anyone to see." Karen frowned, her concern evident. "Harold, you need to be careful. If he catches you—" "I know the risks," Harold interrupted, "but this isn't just about Lily anymore. If he's hurt other kids, we can't let him get away with it." Karen nodded, her expression somber. "All right, let me know how I can help." Harold spent the rest of the day strategizing. He needed a plan, one that would allow him to search Timmons' office without arousing suspicion. The key was a breakthrough, but it was also a liability if Timmons realized it was missing. Harold's already precarious position at the school would be in jeopardy. That evening, as Harold sat alone in his modest apartment, he stared at the key resting on his coffee table. His thoughts drifted to Lily's tear-streaked face, to the trembling words she had whispered that first day. He didn't know what awaited him behind whatever door this key opened, but one thing was certain: he wasn't going to stop until he found out. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the school courtyard where students and parents gathered for the annual spring fling. Bright banners waved lazily in the breeze, the smell of popcorn and sizzling hot dogs mingling in the air. Laughter echoed from the inflatable bounce house near the playground. For most, it was a day of celebration, but for Harold Bennett, it was the perfect distraction. Harold glanced at his watch, his hands clammy despite the cool evening air. Karen Murdoch had assured him that Principal Timmons would be preoccupied at the event, mingling with parents and overseeing the festivities. This window of opportunity was narrow, and every second would count. He adjusted the cleaning cart in front of him, its contents carefully chosen to mask his true intentions. Karen's voice echoed in his mind from their earlier conversation in the nurse's office. "Are you sure about this, Harold? If he catches you—" "I'm sure," Harold had interrupted, his tone firm. "This might be our only shot. We can't let him hide anymore." Harold wheeled his cart down the now empty hallway, the faint sound of carnival music filtering through the walls. The school's administrative wing was unervingly quiet, the fluorescent lights casting a sterile glow over the polished floors. His pulse quickened as he approached Timmons' office. Pulling the brass key from his pocket, Harold took a steadying breath before inserting it into the lock of the storage closet adjacent to the principal's desk. The tumblers clicked softly, and the door creaked open. Inside, the smell of stale paper and cleaning chemicals hit him like a wave. Metal filing cabinets lined the walls, their handles worn from years of use. Harold quickly scanned the labels. Most were innocuous: budget reports, faculty evaluations, maintenance logs, but one drawer labeled simply disciplinary records, caught his eye. With a tug, it slid open, revealing a trove of folders. Harold's heart sank as he flipped through them. Each folder bore the name of a student, some dating back years. The contents, however, made his stomach churn: photographs, notes, transcripts of supposed counseling sessions. The files painted a chilling picture, one that confirmed Harold's worst fears. This wasn't an isolated incident. Timmons had been preying on students for years, using his position to silence them. The evidence was damning, but Harold knew it wouldn't mean anything without proof. He pulled out his phone, his fingers trembling as he began snapping pictures of each page. The sound of voices in the hallway made Harold freeze, his breath catching in his throat. He turned off his phone's flashlight and closed the drawer, his ears straining to identify the source. The voices grew louder, one of them unmistakably belonging to Timmons. Harold's heart pounded as he realized the principal was heading straight for the office. Frantic, Harold scanned the room. He spotted a janitor's closet in the corner, its door slightly ajar. Without a second thought, he slipped inside, pulling the door closed just as Timmons entered through the main door. Through the narrow slats of the door, Harold could see Timmons' silhouette as he moved about the office. The principal was muttering under his breath, his tone agitated. Papers rustled, and the metallic clink of a filing cabinet drawer made Harold's blood run cold. Had Timmons noticed anything missing? Was he already suspicious? Minutes felt like hours as Harold crouched in the cramped closet, his body tense with fear. Finally, the sound of Timmons' footsteps faded, and the office door clicked shut. Harold waited another moment before carefully stepping out, his movements slow and deliberate. He replaced the key on the desk where he'd found it, wiping it down with the hem of his shirt to remove any fingerprints. With one last glance around the room, Harold pushed the storage closet door closed and slipped out of the office. The hallway was empty save for the distant hum of activity from the spring fling. By the time Harold reached the nurse's office, his legs felt like jelly. Karen was waiting for him, her face pale with worry. "Did you get it?" she whispered. Harold nodded, pulling out his phone and showing her the photos. Karen's hand flew to her mouth as she scrolled through the images, her eyes widening with each one. This is worse than I thought," she said, her voice trembling. "We need to show this to the Warrens. They need to know." Harold nodded. "I'll call them, but we have to be careful. If Timmons figures out what we have before we can act, he'll destroy the evidence or worse." That evening, Harold sat in the Warrens' tastefully decorated living room, the tension in the air palpable. Margaret Warren perched on the edge of the couch, her hands gripping the armrest so tightly her knuckles were white. Andrew Warren paced back and forth, his jaw clenched. "Show us," Andrew said, his voice tight. Harold unlocked his phone and handed it to Margaret. She scrolled through the photos in silence, her face going pale. When she handed the phone to Andrew, her hands were trembling. This can't be real," Margaret whispered, tears pooling in her eyes. "He's been doing this to children, to Lily." Andrew's face darkened as he looked at the images. Why didn't anyone stop him before? How did this go unnoticed for so long? Harold hesitated, choosing his words carefully. People like Timmons know how to cover their tracks. They rely on fear, on silence. But we can't stay silent anymore. Margaret wiped her eyes, her expression hardening. "You're right. This ends now. We'll take this to the police, to the school board, to anyone who will listen. He won't get away with this." Andrew nodded, his face set with determination. "We'll fight this for Lily and for every other child he's hurt." As Harold left their home that night, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The Warrens were on his side now, and together they would bring Timmons to justice. But he also knew that the fight was far from over. Timmons was a dangerous man, and the battle ahead would test their resolve in ways they couldn't yet imagine. The morning air at Riverbend Academy was heavy with unease, as if the school itself could sense the storm brewing within its walls. Harold Bennett stepped into the building with a renewed determination, his shoulders squared and his jaw set. In his pocket was the proof, the damning evidence that Margaret and Andrew Warren had already submitted to the school board. But Harold knew better than to trust bureaucracy to act swiftly. Time was of the essence, and he couldn't allow Timmons to continue hiding behind his authority. Margaret and Andrew had filed the formal complaint with the school board that morning, presenting the evidence Harold and Karen had painstakingly gathered. Yet, the response from the board was far from reassuring. Harold had overheard one of the senior board members muttering about avoiding unnecessary scandal and maintaining the school's reputation. Their reluctance to act spoke volumes about where their priorities lay. It wasn't justice for the students. It was damage control. As Harold pushed his cleaning cart down the hallway, his mind raced with thoughts of his next move. He knew he couldn't rely solely on the board. He needed to force the issue, to bring Timmons' actions into the light. His chance came sooner than expected near the main entrance. A cluster of parents stood chatting with teachers, their voices carrying a mix of casual conversation and polite laughter. Timmons stood among them, exuding his usual charm, his voice smooth as silk as he addressed their concerns. Harold's blood boiled at the sight. How could this man, who had preyed on the innocent, stand there so confidently, so smugly, without hesitation? Harold approached the group, his presence immediately drawing attention. "Principal Timmons," Harold said, his voice loud enough to cut through the chatter. The parents and staff turned toward him, their expressions ranging from curiosity to confusion. Timmons' smile faltered for a brief moment before he regained his composure. "Mr. Bennett," he said coolly, "I'm rather busy at the moment. If this is about your duties—" "This isn't about my duties," Harold interrupted, his tone firm. "It's about your actions. I know what you've been doing, and I won't stay silent about it anymore." A murmur rippled through the group as Timmons' expression darkened. "I have no idea what you're talking about," he said, his voice laced with condescension. "If you have concerns, you're welcome to address them through the proper channels." Harold took a step closer, his gaze unwavering. "You know exactly what I'm talking about. Lily Warren, the files in your office, the students you've hurt. How many more children have to suffer before someone stops you?" Timmons' face turned a deep shade of red, his composure cracking. "You're making baseless accusations, Bennett," he spat. "This is slander, and I won't stand for it." The tension in the air was palpable as the parents and staff watched the exchange, their curiosity now tinged with unease. Harold could see doubt flickering in some of their eyes, the seeds of suspicion taking root. "You can call it slander all you want," Harold shot back, his voice rising. "But the evidence is out there, and the Warrens have already taken it to the board. It's only a matter of time before the truth comes out." Timmons' eyes darted around the group, his confident facade slipping further. "This man is a liar," he said, addressing the parents. "He's been bitter ever since I reprimanded him for his poor performance. He'll say anything to get back at me." Harold felt a surge of anger but forced himself to stay calm. "You can try to discredit me all you want, but the truth is on my side. And when it comes out, you'll have to answer for what you've done." The confrontation had drawn more onlookers, their hushed whispers filling the hallway. Timmons, realizing the growing audience, took a step forward, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper meant only for Harold. "You're treading on thin ice, Bennett." Keep this up and you'll regret it. By lunchtime, the fallout from the confrontation had already begun. Harold was called to the administrative office, where a stern-faced HR representative handed him a letter of suspension. The reason given was vague: unprofessional conduct and creating a hostile work environment. But Harold knew it was Timmons' doing. The suspension was a thinly veiled attempt to silence him, to discredit him in the eyes of the staff and parents. As he left the office, the whispers of his colleagues followed him down the hallway. Some avoided his gaze while others offered small nods of support. Harold held his head high, refusing to let the weight of their judgment crush him. He had anticipated retaliation, but if anything, the suspension only fueled his resolve. If they thought they could shut him up by suspending him, they were wrong. This wasn't over. Outside the building, Harold found Karen waiting for him near the parking lot. She looked anxious, her hands gripping the strap of her bag tightly. "I heard what happened," she said, her voice low. "Are you okay?" Harold nodded, though his expression was grim. "They think they can shut me up by suspending me," he said, "but they're wrong. This isn't over." Karen placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "We'll figure this out, Harold. You're not alone in this." As Harold walked away from the school, the letter of suspension crumpled in his hand. He couldn't shake the feeling that the battle was only just beginning. But he knew one thing for certain: he wouldn't stop fighting until Timmons was held accountable, no matter what it cost him. The first ripple of backlash began the morning after Harold Bennett's suspension. By the time the first bell rang at Riverbend Academy, whispers of the confrontation had already spread like wildfire. Parents clustered in small groups outside the school, their conversations punctuated by glances toward the administration building. The allegations against Principal Timmons had shaken the foundation of their once trusted institution. Inside the Warrens' home, Margaret sat at the dining table, her phone buzzing incessantly with messages from concerned parents. Some offered words of support while others expressed disbelief, reluctant to entertain the idea that Timmons could be guilty. Andrew, pacing behind her, clenched his fists. "We can't let this die in whispers," he said. "We need to take this public." Margaret nodded. "I've already contacted a local journalist," she said. "They're interested in the story, but they need more than just our statement. They need proof and people willing to speak on the record." That afternoon, Karen Murdoch sat in her car in the parking lot of a nearby coffee shop, her nerves fraying at the edges. She gripped her phone tightly, debating the risk of what she was about to do. Finally, with a deep breath, she dialed the number of a reporter she had seen cover local corruption cases. "I have information about Riverbend Academy," she said, her voice steady despite the anxiety coursing through her. "But I need to remain anonymous." Over the next 30 minutes, Karen detailed what she and Harold had uncovered, carefully omitting details that could trace the tip back to her. The reporter asked pointed questions, and Karen answered as thoroughly as she dared. By the time she ended the call, her hands were shaking, but a weight had lifted. She had taken a step toward ensuring the truth couldn't be buried. Meanwhile, Harold sat in his modest living room, his notebook open on the coffee table. The suspension had left him with time to reflect, but he couldn't afford to be idle. He flipped through the pages, his detailed observations and timelines staring back at him. He needed more than his notes to push the school board into action. He needed allies. As if on cue, his phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. He hesitated before answering. "This is Harold." The voice on the other end was hesitant but determined. "Mr. Bennett, my name is Rachel Harper. I'm a former student of Riverbend Academy." There was a pause, and Harold could hear the tremble in her voice. I heard about what's happening. I think it's time I came forward." Harold's breath caught. "Rachel, are you saying?" I've been waiting for years for someone to expose him. She interrupted, her voice stronger now. He did the same to me. I was too scared to say anything back then, but I'm not scared anymore. The following morning, Rachel Harper sat across from Harold, Margaret, and Andrew in a quiet corner of a community center. Her hands were clasped tightly around a can of soda, her eyes downcast. I was 10 when it started, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. He'd call me to his office for detention or special counseling. At first, it was just compliments that felt wrong. Then it escalated. Margaret reached across the table, placing a reassuring hand on Rachel's arm. You're incredibly brave for coming forward, she said gently. Your story will make a difference. Rachel nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. I've carried this for so long. If it can help protect other kids, I'll do whatever it takes. Andrew leaned forward. Are you willing to speak to the media? We're working with a journalist who is already investigating. Your testimony could be the tipping point. Rachel hesitated, the weight of the decision evident in her expression. I'll do it, she said finally, but I want to remain anonymous, at least for now. As the week progressed, the story began to take on a life of its own. Local news outlets picked up the allegations, their headlines sending shockwaves through the community. Scandal at Riverbend Academy and principal accused of misconduct dominated the airwaves and social media feeds. Parents began taking sides. Some rallied around the Warrens, their outrage palpable as they demanded accountability. Others, loyal to Timmons, dismissed the allegations as a smear campaign. PDA meetings turned into heated debates, with voices raised and accusations flying. The once tight-knit community was fracturing under the strain. Karen watched the unfolding drama from the sidelines, torn between relief and dread. The attention was necessary to force change, but it also meant greater scrutiny. She received anonymous messages of support from staff members too afraid to speak out. But she also felt the cold stares of those who blamed her for tarnishing the school's reputation. For Harold, the backlash was both a validation and a challenge. He received calls from parents thanking him for his courage, but he also found himself the target of vitriol. One evening, he discovered graffiti scrawled across his garage door, "Liar," in bold red letters. He stood there for a moment, the sight stoking the fire in his chest. He wasn't a liar, and he wouldn't let fear or intimidation silence him. As Harold scrubbed away the hateful message, his phone buzzed with a text from Margaret. Rachel's interview airs tonight at 6. Thought you'd want to know. Harold allowed himself a small smile. The truth was coming out, piece by piece, and with each revelation, Timmons' facade of respectability cracked a little more. The final crack came that evening when Rachel's voice filled the airwaves, her words measured but powerful. I was silent for too long, she said, her face blurred and her name withheld. But no child should have to go through what I did. It's time for the truth to come out. The segment ended with a promise from the journalist. This is just the beginning of our investigation into Riverbend Academy. We will continue to follow this story closely. For the first time in weeks, Harold allowed himself a moment of hope. The walls around Timmons were closing in, and the strength of the community, the parents, the students, and those who dared to speak out, was proving to be a force he couldn't ignore. Harold wasn't just fighting for Lily anymore. He was fighting for every child who had ever been silenced, and he was determined to see it through to the end. The sun was barely rising when the first unmarked police cars pulled into the lot at Riverbend Academy. Their arrival was swift and silent, a contrast to the storm they were about to unleash. Harold Bennett watched from the sidewalk across the street, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. Karen stood beside him, her expression tense but resolute. They both knew this moment had been a long time coming. The investigation had gained momentum after Rachel Harper's testimony aired. Public outrage reached a boiling point, with parents demanding immediate action. Under immense pressure, the school board finally authorized a formal investigation into Principal Timmons' conduct. Law enforcement was called in to ensure the process was thorough and impartial. Harold exhaled slowly as the officers entered the school, accompanied by board members and the lead investigator, Detective Lisa Grayson. She was a no-nonsense woman with sharp eyes and a reputation for cutting through bureaucracy. Harold had met with her the previous day, providing his notes and recounting everything he had witnessed. Her assurance that the investigation would be exhaustive had been the only thing keeping him calm since. Inside the school, the atmosphere was heavy with unease. Teachers whispered nervously in the hallways, and students stared wide-eyed at the officers moving purposefully through the building. Principal Timmons remained in his office, his usual air of authority tinged with visible discomfort. He had been summoned to a meeting with the investigators but refused to vacate his chair without a direct order. When Detective Grayson entered his office, she was flanked by 2 officers. Her tone was cordial but firm. "Mr. Timmons, we're here to execute a search warrant for your office and personal files. Please step aside." Timmons rose slowly, his jaw tightening. "This is absurd," he snapped. "Do you have any idea how much damage these baseless accusations are causing? My reputation, my career. Your cooperation will expedite this process." Grayson interrupted, unfazed. "If there's nothing to hide, you'll have the opportunity to clear your name. But for now, I need you to stand over there." She gestured toward a spot by the door. Reluctantly, Timmons complied, his face reddening with barely suppressed anger. The officers began their search, meticulously combing through filing cabinets, desk drawers, and even the locked storage closet Harold had once broken into. Within minutes, they uncovered folders containing photographs and handwritten notes, evidence far more damning than anyone had anticipated. Grayson's lips pressed into a thin line as she reviewed the contents. She turned to one of the officers. "Bag and tag everything. We'll need forensic analysis." Timmons, now visibly panicked, attempted to interject. "This is all a misunderstanding," he stammered. "Those files are confidential student disciplinary records. They'll be reviewed under the appropriate protocols," Grayson replied sharply. "You'll have your chance to explain." The tension reached its peak later that afternoon when Timmons was escorted out of the school in handcuffs. The sight was surreal. A man who had once commanded fear and respect now reduced to a figure of public disgrace. Students crowded the hallways, their whispers growing louder as they realized what was happening. Teachers tried in vain to maintain order, their own shock evident in their expressions. Outside, a small crowd of parents and community members had gathered. Some jeered while others watched in stunned silence. Harold stood among them, his hands clenched at his sides. Karen was at his elbow, her face pale but determined. Margaret and Andrew Warren were there too, their arms protectively around Lily, who clung to her mother's side. As Timmons was loaded into the back of a police car, his gaze locked briefly with Harold's. For a moment, it seemed like he might say something, but instead he turned away, his shoulders slumping. Harold felt no satisfaction in the man's defeat, only a grim sense of justice finally being served. In the days that followed, the fallout from Timmons' arrest reverberated throughout the community. The school board faced intense scrutiny, with parents demanding answers about how such misconduct had been allowed to persist for so long. Emergency meetings were held where board members vowed to implement sweeping changes to ensure student safety. One of the first actions was the suspension of staff members who had turned a blind eye to Timmons' behavior. Several teachers and administrators were placed on leave pending further investigation. Eileen, the school secretary who had often looked the other way, resigned before disciplinary measures could be taken. "I didn't know the extent of it," she said tearfully during her resignation announcement. But I should have done more. I should have seen the signs. Karen, who had risked her career to expose the truth, became a quiet hero among parents and staff. Her bravery was acknowledged at a community meeting where several parents stood up to thank her publicly. Harold, too, received a standing ovation when Margaret recounted his relentless determination to protect Lily and uncover the truth. For Harold, the victory was bittersweet. He had achieved what he set out to do, but the cost had been high. His suspension from Riverbend Academy was now permanent, and he knew his reputation in the community was irrevocably tied to the scandal. Still, as he sat on the porch of his modest home one evening, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The warm golden light of late afternoon spilled through the windows, and Harold allowed himself a rare smile. He wasn't just leaving behind a job. He was leaving behind a legacy, one built on courage, compassion, and the unwavering belief that doing the right thing was always worth it. The warm golden light of late afternoon spilled through the windows of the Warren household, casting a gentle glow over the living room. Lily sat cross-legged on the couch, a soft blanket draped over her lap as she worked on a colorful drawing. Her parents, Margaret and Andrew, watched her from the kitchen, their voices low as they discussed the progress Lily had made in therapy. "She's stronger than I ever imagined," Margaret said, her voice filled with equal parts awe and relief. "Dr. Phillips said it'll take time, but Lily's already opening up more than expected." Andrew nodded, his gaze fixed on their daughter. "We owe Harold everything. Without him—" He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. The weight of what could have been lingered between them like a shadow, but the relief of what was, Lily safe, healing, and surrounded by love, was enough to keep the darkness at bay. A knock at the door broke the moment. Margaret smiled, already knowing who it was. She crossed the room and opened the door to find Harold Bennett standing on the porch, a warm but humble smile on his face. He held a small potted plant in one hand, a housewarming gift for the family. "Harold, come in," Margaret said, stepping aside to let him enter. "You didn't have to bring anything." "It's just a little something," Harold replied, handing her the plant. "Thought it might brighten up the place." Lily's face lit up when she saw Harold. "Mr. Bennett!" she exclaimed, jumping off the couch and running to hug him. She wrapped her arms around his waist, her small frame trembling with excitement. "Hey there, kiddo," Harold said, his voice soft as he hugged her back. "How's my favorite artist doing?" Lily beamed up at him. "I've been drawing a lot. Want to see?" "Of course," Harold said, letting her pull him toward the couch. She showed him her latest creation, a vibrant picture of a superhero standing tall with a cape flowing in the wind. The figure bore a striking resemblance to Harold, down to the flannel shirt and kind eyes. Harold chuckled, his throat tightening with emotion. "Is that supposed to be me?" Lily nodded enthusiastically. "You're my hero." Harold blinked back tears, humbled by the girl's unwavering gratitude. "You know," he said gently, "real heroes are the ones who keep going, even when things get tough. That's you, Lily." As the evening wore on, the Warrens and Harold sat together in the living room, the conversation flowing easily. Margaret shared updates about Lily's therapy, while Andrew talked about the changes being implemented at Riverbend Academy. The school board had adopted new policies to ensure stricter oversight, and several staff members had been replaced. "They even asked me to come back," Harold said, his tone reflective. "They'd make me head of facilities if I wanted." Margaret raised an eyebrow and Harold smiled faintly. "I turned them down. I think it's time for me to move on. This whole ordeal, it reminded me why I started this job in the first place. I wanted to protect kids, make a difference. And now I feel like I've done that." Andrew nodded in understanding. "You deserve to rest, Harold." but I hope you know you'll always have a place in our family." Harold glanced at Lily, who was now curled up beside him, her head resting on his shoulder. "I think I already do." As the evening turned to dusk, Harold prepared to leave. Lily walked him to the door, her hand tucked in his. "Will you come visit again?" she asked, her voice small but hopeful. "Of course," Harold said. "Any time you need me, I'll be here." Lily smiled, her trust in him unwavering. "Thank you for everything, Mr. Bennet." Harold crouched down to her level, looking her in the eye. "You don't have to thank me, Lily. Just promise me one thing." "What's that?" she asked. "Promise me you'll keep being brave," Harold said, "and keep drawing. The world needs more of your art." Lily nodded solemnly. "I promise." As Harold walked to his car, he paused to take in the quiet beauty of the evening. The stars were just beginning to appear, faint pinpricks of light against the darkening sky. For the first time in years, Harold felt a profound sense of peace. He had honored his late daughter's memory by protecting Lily, and in doing so, he had found a measure of closure. The fight for justice had left its scars, but it had also strengthened bonds, mended wounds, and illuminated a path forward. Harold knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy for Lily or her family, but he also knew they had the resilience to face whatever came next. As he climbed into his car and drove away, Harold allowed himself a rare smile. He wasn't just leaving behind a job. He was leaving behind a legacy, one built on courage, compassion, and the unwavering belief that doing the right thing was always worth the fight.